record this. Or for folks who are tuning in a little bit later, but I'm really pleased and honored to welcome Nabat Modili from Namibia Nature Foundation here today. As we were sharing for those who were in the session just a few minutes ago, this is a good capstone as we think about wildlife conservation projects, what to do, what to focus on, and where to be most effective in our work. So I'll turn it over to our guest speaker today, but I look forward to both learning and sharing through the session and also through the question and answer. So let's try to get some good questions or good ideas that we can share for the exchange for after that. So with that in mind, yeah, the floor is yours. Nabat, thanks so much for joining us and looking forward to your thoughts.
Thank you, Patrick. So as to the audience, as earlier mentioned, my name is Nabat Mbele. I work for a local Namibian NGO called the Namibian Nature Foundation. It's really a big NGO that is involved in conservation as well as sustainable development interventions across the country. We are really the ideal partner when it comes to different organizations and NGOs that we work with across the country. So today I'll briefly be talking about wildlife conservation in Namibia, what is in place, what has been achieved, as well as talk about a couple of challenges. So I really want to make my presentation as brief as possible to leave a lot more room for engagement, questions and answers, because when we're talking about wildlife conservation, it is quite a diverse topic, and we can basically, it's enough to be a module on its own in university. So to have to put it into about 30 minutes, it's quite a cumbersome exercise. So I have prepared a brief PowerPoint presentation. So I'll just try and bring it up for the audience to be able to follow. Is there something showing on your side?
Yeah, looking good on our side.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. So as earlier mentioned, I will be talking about wildlife conservation in Namibia with a focus on CBNRM, which is the community-based natural resource management. So by definition, when we're talking about wildlife conservation, it is the careful preservation and protection of fauna and flora. There is a misconception of wildlife only referring to animals, but by definition, it actually encompasses both plants and animals. And this is also by the definition according to the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So Namibia has a proud conservation record, which is recognized internationally. And this reputation partly is on conservation, which is then practiced outside of your formal and national parks and reserves. Namibia is the first African country that then incorporated the protection of the environment into its constitution contained in Article 95. The protection offered is through the Nature Conservation Ordinance 4 of 1975, which has had a couple of amendments to better this legislative document. So historically, before independence, Namibia became independent in 1990. There has been severe exploitation as well as discriminatory legislation between freehold farmers and communal farmers. whereby freehold farmers basically enjoyed a couple of benefits that were then restricted to communal farmers. I'll get into it a little bit later on, the difference between freehold farmers as well as communal farmers. Um, how the road basically to the success of wildlife conservation in Namibia started when government gave people living in communal areas the opportunity to manage natural resources, which was a legislative amendment to the Nature Conservation Ordinance of 1975, which allowed for the formation of communal conservancies. This is then the Nature Conservation Amendment Act. So Namibia has an ecosystem approach to wildlife conservation using flagship species such as elephant, your black rhino, your lion, your buffalo, which are basically the big five, to assist the country in having an ecosystem approach, basically using this wildlife, this flagship species, to attract the necessary funding needed to pump into conservation efforts. How has this been achieved? This has been achieved by setting aside land for conservation through national parks, private game reserves, and communal conservancies. So your national parks are your bigger ones, such as Etosha National Park, your Dorop National Parks, and so on. There are a couple of private game reserves, such as your Namibia Nature Reserve. There is the Gondwana Nature Reserve as well as in the south. And then we also have a couple of communal conservancies that have been set up across the country. So there are three types of land ownership or land tenure in Namibia. There's the state land, and then you have the freehold land, and then you also have the communal land. So basically, the state land is then your national parks, as well as game reserves that belong to the state. Um, and then you have your freehold land, which is then your private land, of which some of this private land you get farmers that come together, remove fences, and allow the free movement of wildlife by setting up then private game reserves, which is recognized by the state or by the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism. And then there's then also the communal land, whereby the land is owned by community, and it's vested in the state. The ownership of this land is vested in the state. And with the amendment to the Nature Conservation Ordinance that allowed for the setting up of conservancies, basically is on this communal land where conservancies have been given rights over wildlife, which before independence was then only a benefit that was accorded to the freehold land. So looking at where are these areas where wildlife conservation is then practiced, you can see that the area in the green is basically these areas that have been set aside for wildlife conservation, which is a combination of your private game reserve as well as your national parks and your communal conservancies. So primarily in the on my right hand side, when you're looking at the screen, that whole chunk of land all the way up in green, that is primarily the communal conservancies. If you're looking on the left hand side along the coastline of Namibia, that is then from, if you're starting from the top, you're looking at communal conservancies that have been set up as well. And then you have your national park as you are going further down. So it is quite a large stretch of land that has been set aside for conservation or wildlife conservation purposes using the conservation, the holistic approach. Just trying to hide the floating panel that is on my side. So what has been achieved thus far? We're looking at 7,000. Before independence, Namibia had 7,000 elephants. which then increased, and the number currently stands at about 24,000. And it has the world's largest population of black rhino. Um, can we have somebody is busy speaking? Can you mute yourselves, please? Okay. The person that has the name Dutch, can you please mute yourself? Okay, thank you. So the world's largest population of cheetah, of which there's about 3,500 cheetahs in Namibia, and also the world's largest free-roaming black rhino, of which there's about 5,600. We have been able to establish 85 communal conservancies and one community association. The community association is basically a community that is within a national park, and then basically been given rights as well to benefit from the wildlife that is in this national park. This is the Guaguata National Park in the northeast of Namibia. So we are looking at about 166,000 square kilometers of area that is under conservation, which is about 20% of the country, with over 233,000 residents that are living in these protected areas or areas that are under some form of protection. For the folks that are in the US, this might probably sound like it's a small number, but then looking at the population of Namibia, it's quite a small population with about 2.3 million people, and it has the second least population density after Mongolia. So if we're talking about 233,000, that is quite a substantive amount compared to the 2.3 million. So out of this, all 85 conservancies and the community association is involved in wildlife monitoring for conservation purposes or wildlife conservation. And there is about 763 community game guards that are involved in delivering this wildlife conservation. And this has contributed about 720 million US dollar to the country's net income, which has basically been through various economic related activities to wildlife conservation, such as your tourism as well as trophy hunting. And there is about 272,419 kilograms of game meat, which has been distributed to residents. And through these various wildlife conservation efforts, about 3,548 jobs have been created. So all of these successes that I'm talking about, how has this been achieved? It has been through a joint wildlife monitoring system effort implemented by the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism, together with local NGOs, conservancies, and so on. The local NGOs are organized around an association called NACSO, which is the Namibian Association of CBN Support Organizations, which is about 11 different NGOs that come together and implement wildlife monitoring system. And it's organized around three pillars, which is basically business enterprise and livelihoods, really looking at how to build enterprises and improve people's livelihoods that are involved in wildlife conservation. There is then your natural resource management working group, which looks at basically the science part, monitoring wildlife, implementing various monitoring systems, of which there are four systems, which is the event book or incident book, which is a yellow book. You can see that there's a picture of how this looks like. And then once this data is collected through the event book system, which basically records your spoor, as well as animal sighting, as well as human wildlife conflict incidences, everything basically that involves wildlife is then recorded in this yellow book, as well as annual game counts, that are conducted across various conservancies and areas. And then it goes through a data entry and verification on a national level, where data is then pulled together from all these various conservancies, the 85 conservancies that I mentioned earlier on. And then once the data is then has gone through verification and so on, an adaptive management feedback session is then conducted where audit posters are then sent back to the collectors of this data to really understand the numbers as well as the behavior of the wildlife for them to be able to exercise adaptive management in their respective conservancies. So, what are the threats and challenges to wildlife conservation in Namibia? The biggest one is really human-wildlife conflict, because Namibia has enjoyed an increase in wildlife population. It also means that there is frequent encounters between humans and wildlife. So climate change is also one of the threats and challenges that the country faces, climate change and drought, because I think we should know that drought is not, or climate change doesn't only cause drought, it is basically irregular patterns of climate across the whole country, where you'll have severe droughts in the areas where there was droughts and floods and so on. So that is why those two have been taken apart. We also have conflicting and competing land uses as a serious challenge that is facing wildlife conservation. We have people that are doing livestock farming, you have people that are doing crop farming, and their livestock is continuously they're continuously losing livestock to predators such as your lions, your hyenas, your leopards, and so on, that have been increasing in numbers across the years. People's livestock, or I mean, crops are being raided continuously by elephants and so on. With a high unemployment rate in Namibia, this also facilitated an increase in poaching incidences as people are looking at getting income through various revenues. We are faced with organized poaching syndicates that are then recruiting your Namibians that are poor and those that are also unemployed to do poaching on their behalf, with elephants and rhinos primarily targeted for their ivory as well as the rhino horn, which fetches a lot of money on the Asian markets used for Asian medicine. Diminished conservation funding is also a threat that we're facing. Namibia has become classified as an upper middle income country, which then also meant that a lot of development agencies pulled out their funding, even though there is quite a lot of disparities when we are looking at the available funding, whereby the gap between the poor and the rich is extremely high, and gives a false sense of the country's status. International environmental governance is also a threat that the country is facing, and more on a regional level, where you have the Southern African sub-region that has been doing really good when it comes to conservation efforts, and they are implementing your sustainable utilization conservation model through quotas or off-take quotas, as well as trophy hunting and so on. But if we are looking at the international environmental governance community, such as your Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, CITES, there are some regulations that have been put in place that are not pro-sustainable use, and they are not pro-hunting, more in favor of regions that are really experiencing wildlife declines when we start talking about East Africa, West Africa, as well as other parts of the world. What really needs to be done? Research. This is really important. Researching on mitigation strategies that can be deployed to basically mitigate and bring down human-wildlife conflict, as well as just test and find out what works in terms of bringing predator numbers down and so on. Also build incentives. There's a need to build incentives through development projects. This is also an area that is open to the group that is here, where we can implement development projects, create employment opportunities. Better land use planning is also required to then counteract the conflicting land uses that we have, as well as needing to find sustainable financing models for the country not to be dependent on one income stream. And this is something that we were really able to learn from when COVID hit Namibia or the world, and these restrictions were put in place. The conservation model was highly dependent on tourism, and because of that, the whole model was brought to its knees. And lucky enough, the government, as well as a couple of development partners and NGOs, were able to come together and put together a facility called the COVID Recovery Resilience Facility, which then provided grants to all these different NGOs that are implementing, as well as conservancies, to be able to retain this conservation model that is in place. So who's really involved when it comes to wildlife conservation? So it is really a lot of partners, starting with the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism, different NGOs that are united under the umbrella of community conservation in Namibia, NACSO, WWF, IRDNC, Namibia Nature Foundation, to mention a few. So that'll be the end of my presentation, which will then allow us to take questions and interact. I'm open to answering a couple of questions from the presentation that I just gave, but also just in general from a wildlife conservation point of perspective. As I indicated, it's really broad and diverse. I didn't want to dwell much into what is being done on private game reserves, as well as what is being done in the national parks. But then what is being done in the national parks is really similar to what you find in communal conservancies. The event book system also being implemented in the national parks, different in the national parks because now you have your game ranges that are implementing it, as opposed to in conservancies where you have your game guards, as well as rhino rangers that are implementing the event book system. So I'll end there for now. Patrick, I also see there hasn't been any questions coming through in the chat, but perhaps, we can take some questions.
So folks, especially if you have limited connectivity right now, I would really recommend that you add some questions to the chat here. Maybe just be as those are coming in, I'll ask for maybe just a quick follow-up, because I think it'll be helpful for folks. Could you just speak to two things? One is, what's the general sense kind of across Namibia with people outside of wildlife conservation? How much support is there for the Namibian model of continuing it? Because I think it's really special across the world. So how much support is there for that model? That's sort of question one. And then question two, maybe just to expand a little bit, what needs to be done? In particular, what can youth do? What could they or should they do as they think about supporting wildlife conservation? And then I'm sure we'll have lots of other good questions. So maybe just start there, please. Oh, I think you're still on mute.
Oh yes, yeah. Sorry for that. Yeah. So there's really a huge support for wildlife conservation across Namibia with a continuous call for communities that are living or communities that are living outside of these formally protected areas calling to be recognized as conservancies. Some are setting themselves up as conservancies. Some are requesting to be gazetted as community forest to basically get rights over all of the natural resources because basically now as it stands, the rights that are accorded to conservancies is only really over wildlife or game, as is mentioned in the Nature Conservation Ordinance, and it doesn't really grant rights to all of the other natural resources. So there is really a good buy-in, but to a certain extent, there are mixed feelings about it because of diminishing returns to the communities, and we have also seen an increase in wildlife numbers that has been causing a lot of conflict, raiding of crop fields, elephants, livestock that are continuously being predated on and so on. So there is really mixed feelings about it. As to how youth can become involved in wildlife conservation, and this is actually really important. We are trying to drive a youth campaign for the protection of wildlife and just being involved in wildlife conservation. Um, it's basically through development projects, being active on social media, defending the country's position. First, by understanding what are the different wildlife conservation efforts that are being deployed and being able to counter false claims about wildlife conservation efforts that are being done in the country. There's opportunities to get involved in climate change efforts, CBD, convention on biological diversity, on different levels. Really just understanding, because what we've also been able to pick up is that there is a disconnect between urban youth as well as rural youth. So we need urban youth to really get a lot more involved and find means and ways of reaching out to the rural youth to also understand what are some of the challenges that they are experiencing.
Oh, thank you so much. And it looks like there's some really wonderful questions in the chat here as well.
Okay, I'll look at the first one, which says, in all current challenges, which one would you say is the most pressing? So the most pressing one, I would say, is human-wildlife conflict, because here we are talking about people's livelihoods. People are losing their livestock, they are losing their crop fields while already being devastated by drought. And basically people's lives are also at threat when they're continuously confronted by elephants, when they're continuously confronted by lions, and we're talking about really big predators in their backyards. So I would say that this is the most pressing. How far has Namibia gone in conserving pangolins? So pangolins has actually been accorded one of the highest protection in the country, together with the black rhino. There are a couple of NGOs that we work with that have been set up primarily targeting and looking at pangolins. We are working with IUCN, Traffic, one of those basically NGOs set up through CITES, the Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species, to try and traffic wildlife crime, specifically for pangolins. So there's really a lot of efforts. And as far as the airport officials have also been trained in being able to detect smuggling of pangolin scales and so on. So there's really a lot of efforts that has gone as far as that. Yeah, there's actually a lot of questions that are busy popping up. If there are ideas on mitigation, ideas on solving these issues, are there tools made available to further, let's say, prototype from NNF? Um, so there are a couple of mitigation strategies that are being experimented with across the country. But then what we've also been able to realize is that uh, wild animals, predators, especially also elephants, are really smart. So it only works for some time. So there is a need to be to continuously innovate and come up with different ideas because animals also find means and ways around strategies that are being deployed. And that is why in my slide, I was also highlighting the need for continuous research, testing out new ways that work, because they might work in one area, but then if you take the same strategy to a different area again, then it's not effective at all. Patrick, perhaps you can be helping with the questions, just so that I can keep track
Yeah,
of
yeah.
what is being
Let
asked.
me
Yeah,
summarize a couple. Um,
yeah,
yeah, so I think there's a theme of why is Namibia so unique in its conservation strategies and policies, and maybe perhaps more successful than other countries. And I think the hypothesis for our program design is that Namibia is very unique, and that it's not necessarily, although it's enshrined in the constitution, it's not necessarily a given that the next generation will continue to support, or the future generations. So I think by talking about its uniqueness, you might touch a little bit upon how to kind of keep it unique in the future as well.
yeah. So what has made Namibia unique is the rights that have been given to communities to benefit from wildlife, in the sense that you were then able to secure a larger part of the country as being under some sort of protection. And then you have the people that are on the ground, your communities being then the stewards that are the ones that are protecting this wildlife. So it created a sense of allowing the free movement of wildlife between national parks into these adjacent communities to national parks, creating corridors, allowing the transit of wildlife between national parks within the country, but then also outside of the country through the Kaza Transfrontier Conservation Area as one of them, the Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area. Up in the northwest, you have the Iona Skeleton Coast, together with Botswana, and then the Ice Richtersveld. So already by having community buy-in and holding the rights over this wildlife, they then become the custodians that are really driving the conservation efforts of this wildlife. I think this is what makes Namibia really unique, because you're looking at the driest sub-Saharan country that has been able to increase their numbers. An example of that being from 7,000 before 1990 to 24,000, over 24,000 by 2023. This is now elephants that I'm referring to. But then all other wildlife has also been able to increase. And also just being able to overcome challenges. Like currently we're experiencing a severe drought in the northwest, which has reduced a lot of wildlife numbers. But then again, the state is really willing to translocate wildlife from the national parks, where there's a lot of a high aggregation of it, into this communal as well as private game reserves to enable wildlife to thrive. And since I think 1990 to about 2013, from the last statistics that I saw, there has been about 15,000 different animals that have been translocated across various parts in Namibia.
Thank you. There's a couple questions about how youth can get engaged in campaigns and programs, and specifically connected to the partners who are working on these types of projects. And what's interesting in the chat here is actually some of our participants are sharing campaigns that they've gotten connected to, and others are kind of curious about like how do I hear about this? And I think this is kind of an interesting dialogue that we can have here, because I would imagine from your side, you're thinking, how do I get youth to like learn about what we're doing, and how do we get youth to like really appreciate all the great work? And so yeah, maybe we can just have some ideation on connecting these great researchers and these great policymakers and these great actual practitioners of conservation and the youth that want to be engaged or need to be engaged.
Yeah. With our partners, WWF, we have launched the Youth in Conservation Movement, which basically looks at bringing different youth on board to be the champions that will be driving the conversation when it comes to conservation as well as sustainable development, because all of these need to be in balance. Trying to really have platforms, trainings, dialogues, discussions on conservation, celebrating environmental days as well as Earth Hours and so on through various campaigns that we're having. One of those that has been running for a couple of years is the Rhino Youth Pride campaign in Corijas, which basically advocates for the conservation of rhinos. But with Earth Hour, WWF has been championing that movement of the youth in conservation movement rather.
Which social media platforms are most popular for engagement around wildlife conservation in Namibia? Like where should students look towards? What platforms is it? TikTok or Instagram? How are these organizations really promoting some of these initiatives?
A lot of these initiatives has been promoted on Facebook, as well as Twitter, and Instagram. But I have to admit that conservation hasn't been a fun topic. It has always been serious business. How do we conserve? What needs to be in place, and so on. And that has been a topic that hasn't been able to attract a lot of youth. But now we're looking at how we can change the status quo. How do we make conservation fun? How can we attract youth? And perhaps that can be one of those innovative ideas that might be coming from this group as to how exactly can we engage them. And starting off with the organization that I work for, Namibia Nature Foundation, WWF, or NAXO as a whole, how we can engage youth. So it's really also a question that I'm posing there, because we have been facing severe funding challenges, where you start with a campaign that only lasts probably for a year or two, depending on the funding. And then the whole momentum that has been built up then dies out with that.
Yeah, maybe that's maybe another thread to talk a little bit about, because you noted that as one of the big challenges with funding. Where does funding typically come from right now, and where do you think it ought to come from in the future to sustain what's happening, or maybe even grow the good work that's currently occurring?
So the funding primarily comes from the bigger, most common development agencies, USAID, as well as GIZ, the European Union, a couple of those. Those are sort of the bigger ones that are financing conservation. But then one also goes to the smaller ones, such as the African Development Bank, SADC, that provides smaller grants. But then the problem again, when we're talking about conservation, it's a long-term intervention. It's not something. These challenges cannot be addressed through short-term projects, which are primarily looking at 3 to 5 years. But then, if we are able to secure sustainable financing, where we can talk about 10 to 15, if not 20 years, to be able to continue these interventions, because between 3 to 5 years, when this project comes to an end, then there's no guarantee that there's going to be follow-on funding. And that has been our experience in that after this funding comes to an end, there's no follow-on funding. Depending on the donor's interest, they shift to something totally different. These disparities have really been causing a lot of problems. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then really just
Oh, sorry.
trying to come up with long-term sustainable financing. What we have been able to do in Namibia is set up the Community Conservation Fund of Namibia that is looking at setting up an endowment fund as well as a sinking fund from which we can be able to get long-term financing. But then the problem is now having to convince donors to put in their money into this fund that has been established without them seeing the immediate impact, because this then means that you're investing in the long run. You don't necessarily have influence over what this money is going to be used for in the short term. So the buy-in is a little bit slow on that, but then the momentum has started.
Thank you. There's a question from Albertina about tourism and its relationship to stable sources of income. I imagine it's much more complicated now with COVID, and maybe what was stable is not necessarily as stable. But could you speak to tourism in particular as it relates to funding some of this important work?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Tourism has been the primary focus or funding source for wildlife conservation in Namibia through job creation, whereby government goes into uh, agreements with the private sector to set up tourism establishments that goes into partnership with communities, and then they get concessions or joint concessions in national parks to then be able to get money that is then pumped back into development projects. Because of the diverse challenges that the country is facing, the income that is generated is not necessarily pumped fully back into conservation efforts, but also into community development initiatives, such as scholarships for students, funeral benefits, rural water supplies, as well as electrification projects. So there has really been a lot of money being pumped into that. Um, Through conservation hunting or trophy hunting, the state has the Game Products Trust Fund, where this money that is generated through trophy hunting goes into, and it's used to as an offset payment. Some people confuse it with compensation, but it's actually an offset payment to farmers that are experiencing losses. The event book system that I was referring to, the game guards attend to each and every incident of losses that farmers incur. They record it, and then they are then paid a certain amount, which is then prescribed in the human wildlife conflict policy as to a cow has this value, a goat has this certain value, and then they get that as an offset payment, but not necessarily compensation. Because of the limited funding, this product is only able to sustain offset payments as opposed to compensating the actual value of the losses.
Got it. Thank you. I wondered if you could speak a little bit to um, how environmental education, more broadly and more specifically, wildlife conservation prioritization is integrated or not into the average Namibian's educational experience. So if you think about kind of the early stages of school all the way until they graduate and before university, are all Namibians getting some sense in their educational experience what's going on with wildlife conservation and why it's important, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily. They really get the basic briefing on understanding natural resources as opposed to wildlife conservation. A lot of them actually don't even go out to really experience and see this wildlife, especially the young guys that are in the towns. but also in villages where certain animals are not frequent, they don't really get to experience or get proper education on wildlife conservation. There are a couple of environmental education centers that are run by the Ministry of Environment and Tourism. But then in most cases, some schools cannot afford to then go to these centers and get a week-long program on environmental education. So it's really it's a small percentage that gets a good understanding on wildlife conservation all the way up until university, except those that then study programs such as conservation or natural resource management that then get directly exposed on wildlife conservation.
Thank you. I just wanted to flag a comment because it's really great here in the chat. Vicheli, who I believe is in the northern part of Namibia, has done a lot of engagement with different groups, and she mentioned she helped pilot the Namibia Wildlife Atlasing app, which I think is part of NNF. And maybe you could speak to that a little bit because it seems like she's been doing some really interesting work with that, and that might be another way for youth to get engaged.
Yes, thank you for that. That was one of the things that I forgot. So this is the citizen science approach that we are having, which is being rolled out where young people can get involved in collecting data on wildlife sighting, where they can with a smartphone take a picture and so on. And some can actually go onto the website and really look at what is out there, the distribution, the range of various species. Last year, we had a really rare sighting that was done in North Central. I can't quite remember the species of a snake that hadn't been seen in the last, I think, 6 years or so. And then one of the guys that are involved in this app was actually able to record that and bring it into the limelight. So it's one of those platforms where youth can get involved. Yes.
That's great. Thank you. I think I've covered almost all of the questions and ideas in the chat here. If I've missed it, you can unmute yourself or add it. And if there's any follow-up questions, we've got a little over 5 minutes left if people want to ask anything else or comment on any of the points that were shared. Yeah, any thoughts, folks, from the audience?
I had a question about cooperation with neighboring states. So I guess the question would be, does Namibia see its success as cooperative with neighboring states, or is Namibia's conservation sort of this really have to react very much with Zambia or with other neighboring countries?
Um, I would say it's a bit of both. If you look at the Namibia CBNRM program, it is basically borrowed from a concept borrowed from the Zimbabwean campfire program, and Namibia just took it and then refined it and made it better. Um, but then, in terms of wildlife conservation, we have really been working closely with our partner countries to enable the free movement of wildlife across the borders, particularly by coming up with transfrontier conservation areas. The Kaza Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area being one of them, which is actually the biggest transfrontier conservation area in the world. And in the south, you have the Ice Richterveld, as well as the Iona Skeleton Coast up in the north with Angola. So there has really been a lot of transboundary collaboration to allow the free movement, as well as just joint wildlife monitoring efforts. Through the event book system that I was talking about earlier on, we had been able to roll this out into Angola, as well as conduct joint patrols with Zambia as well and Botswana. So there's a lot of collaboration. So that really the success is from the collaboration. If you're looking at where the highest elephant population is within the Kasa landscape, 113,000 elephants are in Botswana alone. And we're talking about then 24,000 in Namibia. And they are moving around Botswana, Namibia, Zambia, Angola in the Kasa landscape. So that's where a lot of these successes has been derived from.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add on to this, and just for especially the Americans might not think about this too often, but animals just don't really they're not aware, of course, of borders, and some of the borders weren't drawn according to what's natural in terms of topography or geographic areas. But I think if I'm correct on my Namibian history, Namibia was originally colonized, unfortunately, by the Germans, which bordered Angola, colonized by the Portuguese, and then on other sides of Namibia, colonized by the British. So you have all these sort of strange borders that don't respect ethnic groups or geographic boundaries, and don't make sense from an animal's perspective. So that cooperation of why it's so important. But if I'm correct in that assertion.
No, definitely. You are correct. It was colonized by Germany, and then later on by South Africa, and then it was called Southwest Africa. And basically, after the First World War, South Africa, which was then a British ally, moved over and annexed Namibia. So you can see in the south, we have the border with South Africa. To the east, we then have Botswana. And here in the Kasa, so there's this strip that extends outwards, then bordering Zambia, and to a less extent Zimbabwe. And then you have Angola in the north. So that is basically, and if you're looking at this red line showing Kasa, it's just that I don't have the map that shows the bigger Kasa, basically, which includes Namibia, Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe. It's a really massive area where wildlife can roam around freely. Like you mentioned, animals don't know borders. Yeah.
Well, I think we're coming up on our hour here, and I just want to say that we're incredibly grateful for the time and expertise. This is a really engaging discussion and a lot of great information for our folks. So thank you for sharing. Perhaps you could close with any inspiration or thoughts for these group of youth who want to make a big difference on wildlife conservation, and any closing thoughts for them to consider as they go and embark in their efforts.
Yes, definitely. I'm really excited that this group is discussing wildlife conservation. I mean, we are having one of the biggest countries, the US, being part of this and also learning about our conservation efforts. And it's good to actually understand the conservation efforts that we're deploying, because there's a lot of misinformation going around. You have animal rights movements that are going around spreading misinformation. And unfortunately, Namibians also catch onto this, especially the urban youth that have a disconnect with the rural youth and don't understand what is happening on the ground. Because then when you have celebrities that are building up a certain hype about an issue without really understanding, based on false information, then it can be one of those challenges and threats. So my message is, let's get involved, let's understand what is in place, and really just make wildlife conservation fun, because nowadays it's really boring. I'm really looking forward to people reaching out to me. If you go onto our website, www.nnf.org.na, you can, I'm on that website. I have an email address. You can engage me even on social media, on our Facebook, our Instagram. I'm highly active. I participate on the company's profile. So you can reach out to me and then find means and ways how we can make conservation fun for young people.
Ah, what a great capstone! And we'll find you on social media. But let's make wildlife conservation fun. I really appreciate that. That's great for us. So thank you once again. Everybody, folks, let's share a round of applause or raise your hands for Nabat. Thanks for sharing time and energy and ideas with us. And we look forward to following your great work.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Take care, all. Thank you.